Saturday, the 16th of January, 1982, Sidra Shmot. The open microphone is not being resurrected. It never really died. We just were more flexible with it. First of all, I would like to thank Rabbi Lewittes and Herbert Newman, Myron Bassman, for pinch hitting in my absence last week. I'm feeling a little better. What I want to do this morning is read something to you. I have my own very strong reactions to the material that I'm going to read to you, and what I would like is for you to respond first, because I don't want to bias you in any way. We did this once before extremely successfully. I don't know whether any of you remember when it was. Do you remember when it was? The book, the author? Many years ago, 10, 15 years ago. It was a Catholic text. I can't remember the man's name, but anyway, he was from Queen's College. And does anybody remember that occasion? I simply read a chapter from this book, and the congregation responded. Well, anyway, we're going to do it again. I remember. Some of you may have read the article. I'm not going to identify the article, although I'm quite sure most of you will have read it this week, because I'm sure you read what I read. If you have already read it, I apologize for boring you with it again. If you have not already read it, I also apologize, because it may not be the sort of thing you care to hear in synagogue. But the fact is that, as we all know by now, the rabbi can read what is appropriate from here, and some people will think it's appropriate some of the time, and all of you will think it's appropriate some of the time, but there will never be an occasion when all of you will think it's appropriate all of the time. So it's probably one of those occasions. At any rate, what I'm going to do is simply I'm going to read it, when I finish reading it, I'm simply going to sit down somewhere there, so you don't have to turn around to look at me. And I would like members of the congregation to simply come up and respond. And when I say respond, I really mean respond on any level whatsoever. As I say, I have some very definite responses on many very different levels, but I promise faithfully not to be judgmental. Because I think last time people felt that it wasn't fair. I sort of set you all up and then knocked you all down. And I promise faithfully not to do that today. But as I say, I do have very strong feelings about this. And I'm sure that all of you will recognize some of the points or themes here. And I thought it was something that warranted being discussion in synagogue this morning. Also, we'll try to link it up with Jewish tradition. The title is The Man in the Water. As disasters go, this one was terrible, but not unique, certainly not among the worst on the roster of U.S. air crashes. There was the unusual element of the bridge, of course, and the fact that the plane clipped it at a moment of high traffic. One routine thus intersecting another and disrupting both. Then, too, there was the location of the event, Washington, the city of form and regulations, turned chaotic, deregulated by a blast of real winter and a single slap of metal on metal. The jets from Washington National Airport that normally swoop around the presidential monuments like famished gulls are for the moment emblemized by the one that fell. So there is that detail. And there was the aesthetic clash as well. Blue and green Air Florida, the name of flying gardens sunk down among gray chunks in a black river. All that was worth noticing, to be sure. Still, there was nothing very special in any of it except death, which, while always special, does not necessarily bring millions to tears or to attention. Why, then, the shock here. Can you all hear, by the way? Perhaps because the nation saw in this disaster something more than a mechanical failure. Perhaps because people saw in it no failure at all, but rather something successful about their makeup. Here, after all, were two forms of nature in collision: the elements and human character. Last Wednesday, the elements, indifferent as ever, brought down Flight 90, and on that same afternoon, human nature, groping and flailing in mysteries of its own, rose to the occasion. Of the four acknowledged heroes of the event, three are able to account for their behavior. Donald Usher, Eugene Windsor, a Park police helicopter team, risked their lives every time they dipped the skids into the water to pick up survivors. On television, side by side, in bright blue jumpsuits, they described their courage as all in the line of duty. Lenny Skutnik, a 28-year-old employee of the Congressional Budget Office, said, "It's something I never thought I would do," referring to his jumping into the water to drag an injured woman to shore. Skutnik added that somebody had to go in the water, delivering every hero's line that is no less admirable for its repetitions. In fact, nobody had to go into the water. That somebody actually did so is part of the reason this particular tragedy sticks in the mind. But the person most responsible for the emotional impact of the disaster is the one known at first simply as the man in the water. Balding, probably in his 50s, an extravagant moustache. He was seen clinging with 5 other survivors to the tail section of the airplane. This man was described by Usher and Windsor as appearing alert and in control. Every time they lowered a lifeline and flotation ring to him, he passed it on to another of the passengers. "In a mass casualty, you'll find people like him," said Windsor. "But I've never seen one with that commitment." When the helicopter came back for him, the man had gone under. His selflessness was one reason the story held national attention, his anonymity another. The fact that he went unidentified invested him with a universal character. For a while he was every man, and thus proof, as if one needed it, that no man is ordinary. Still, he could never have imagined such a capacity in himself. Only minutes before his character was tested, he was sitting in the ordinary plane among the ordinary passengers, dutifully listening to the stewardess telling him to fasten his seatbelt and saying something about the no smoking sign. So our man relaxed with the others, some of whom would owe their lives to him. Perhaps he started to read, or to doze, or to regret some harsh remark made in the office that morning. Then, suddenly, he knew that the trip would not be ordinary. Like every other person on that flight, he was desperate to live, which makes his final act so stunning. For at some moment in the water, he must have realized that he could not live if he continued to hand over the rope and ring to others. He had to know it, no matter how gradual the effect of the cold. In his judgment, he had no choice. When the helicopter took off with what was to be the last survivor, he watched everything in the world move away from him, and he deliberately let it happen. Yet there was something else about the man that kept our thoughts on him and which keeps our thoughts on him still. He was there in the essential, classic circumstance, man in nature, the man in the water. For its part, nature cared nothing about the 5 passengers. Our man, on the other hand, cared totally. So the timeless battle commenced in the Potomac. For as long as that man could last, they went at each other, nature and man, the one making no distinctions of good and evil, acting on no principles, offering no lifelines, the other acting wholly on distinctions, principles, and, one supposes, on faith. Since it was he who lost the fight, we ought to come again to the conclusion that people are powerless in the world. In reality, we believe the reverse. And it takes the act of the man in the water to remind us of our true feelings in this matter. It is not to say that everyone would have acted as he did, or as Usher, Windsor, and Skutnik. Yet whatever moved these men to challenge death on behalf of their fellows is not peculiar to them. Everyone feels the possibility in himself. That is the abiding wonder of the story. That is why we would not let go of it. If the man in the water gave a lifeline to the people gasping for survival, he was likewise giving a lifeline to those who observed him. The odd thing is that we do not even really believe that the man in the water lost his fight. Everything in nature contains all the powers of nature, said Emerson. Exactly. So the man in the water had his own natural powers. He could not make ice storms or freeze the water until it froze the blood, but he could hand life over to a stranger, and that is a power of nature too. The man in the water pitted himself against an implacable, impersonal enemy. He fought it with charity, and he held it to a standoff. He was the best we can do.
Taking Alan's offer to react without being constrained by the form of the reaction, I'd just like to add a little something to this. My name is Michael Davidson, a member of the congregation. The day that plane went down, I was in St. Petersburg, which is where the plane was supposed to go, and had actually taken an earlier flight out of New York down there. And about 6 o'clock in the evening, I was sitting in the hotel room, and the television came on, and there had been reports of this all during the day, and none of it had any kind of reality. And suddenly must have been about 11 o'clock at night, the woman newscaster came on, and she just read the list of names of people who had been on the plane. No other comment, just that they had finally gotten the list of the names, and just went down this list of 60 or 70 people. And just sitting there, it suddenly became very real. These were real people. This was Mr. and Mrs. So-and-so, and Dr. So-and-so, and Mr. and Mrs. So, and Master So-and-so, I guess how they referred to children. And my reaction again now, and I'm not sure I add very much, is just, I had no way of comprehending this. None of it is still any comprehensible. I mean, that one man at age of 50 basically decided that he would choose not to live in exchange for other people's lives. But then this other event of the earth, it felt like the earth just suddenly opened and swallowed up these 70 lives. And it was more than just numbers of people. It was 70 families, 70 whatever they were. And suddenly it just opened up and closed again, and everything that had been going on was over. I can't offer anything further, but just to share with you that kind of feeling of just, I don't know how to comprehend it. I have no way to begin to understand any of this.
I'm disturbed by the last sentence in the article. This is the best we can do. Certainly a man who sacrifices his life for other people is a great inspiration to all of us. However, I have recently been reading compositions written by 10th grade high school students. They wrote about the New York subways. They wrote about the New York subways and their neighborhoods. And one of my worst students wrote a fantasy. He lives in a neighborhood where everybody cares for everybody else, where there's no crime, no vandalism, and everybody is safe. I asked him, this is the best thing he ever did. He knew it because he kept asking me, whether I read his composition yet. And then I said, is this true? He says, no, it's a fantasy. These are fantasies that people have. It seems to me that we can do a lot better than just to be great ourselves. We can get together somehow and change this world and make it a hell of a lot better than it is.
My name is Herb Newman. I recall reading the same article, and the episode was very vivid to me because in the course of my work I must have taken that runway pattern at least 100 times in the past 3 years, and the 14th Street Bridge is something that I pass over every month. So the idea of a plane falling just at that place, which is so familiar to me, would be a plane falling in Central Park. So it gets closer. But yet, I don't know exactly the rabbi's position on this, but I know in reading the article, my first feeling was there's a bit of rhetoric in the writing of this article, because it would imply that he was one of a very few people that might possibly do what he did. And it seemed to me, as I thought of it, that in all probability, when he saw himself capable of helping others, in other words, he may not have had broken bones, or I surmise this, of course, but so few survived, and the few survivors that he was able to help or pass on the lifeline probably were, in his estimation, a lot worse off than he was. The question is whether he had the intent of sacrificing his life to help those, or just the intent to help when he was in the position to help. The same way that I can't distinguish that differently between a fireman going into a blazing inferno to help people out, simply and to be able to rationalize it, well, he's being paid for it. At the particular time that he's going into the flames, he's not being paid for it in his mind. He's going in there because that's a kind of motivation that he has in taking on this kind of work, and the conditions require that at the moment. And perhaps he's better prepared for it. It didn't happen all of a sudden as in a disaster. But there are people who put out their lives every day in this world, and I don't think that this person is so unique, except that the circumstances were particularly unique.
I'd like to pick up on what Herb said in just a minute. First, I wanted to mention that I first heard about the plane crash through a friend in my office who was on the phone with London at the time, and the crash was being carried live on London TV over satellite, so that we heard about it through London. I tend to have a lot of sympathy with the statement that the noblest act of a human being is to give his or her life for someone else. When I said I wanted to pick up on what Herb was saying, it seems to me there are many ways of doing that, and we tend to focus on the more dramatic ways. In time of disaster, or even someone like a fireman going into a blazing inferno, you're talking about someone who's ready to give up his or her life all at once, in one instant. And it seems to me that there are many smaller ways of doing that, that every time someone puts aside his or her own concerns to try to help out someone else, that person is in effect giving a little bit of his life for the other person.
My name's Sherry, and my reaction to that story was a very personal one, because if that plane had crashed in St. Petersburg, I or some of my friends would have been involved in the rescue. When you're out on a rescue or something like that, death and injury is always a possibility, but it's not something that you think about. If you go into a situation where you're deciding to jump on a burning boat or whatever happens to be the situation, before you start out, you think, well, I know my values, and I'll act in accordance with them, and whatever I have to pay for it, that's part of the choice. You don't really think about what's going to happen to you. It's a way of defining yourself. That's the reason that I'm involved in it. And for me, it's also very related to religion in that sense, because whatever you do, you're defining yourself, living Torah. Whatever a person decides to do is an expression of what they are, as is religion. And that's what this means to me. When I'm in a situation like this, it's an expression of self. And in that sense, death or life doesn't really matter, depending on what your values are. A meaning like that you take from an emergency situation and put it into the rest of your life, so that whatever you do becomes a question of values. And that's religion.
Rosalind Brecker, member of the congregation. I'm concerned with the random quality of this, why the randomness should hold us when in the last weeks we've had 3 terrible explosions in Kentucky coal mines, and somehow, aside from all the other individual killings that go on daily that we pay little or no attention to, is it the quality of the drama, the fact that each one of us has sat in a plane at some time and had a thought flash through, my God, supposing it goes down, or what would I do, and is my seat belt, and so on. And to me, it is a reflection of what do we need to feel human. Do we need this quality of the hero to come at us once more, to say, no, we're not cogs, no, we don't have to just go and say, well, it's another coal mine. What does it compel us to do in looking around at the quality of our own lives, not placing ourselves in the water, but just walking down the street when the blind person stands at the corner tapping, and we all walk by? And I think that, to me, is the story. Maybe the man went from exhaustion, maybe he went from heroism, whatever it is, but I think he points a finger at us.
I'd just like to make a quick analysis between 2 of our heroes. One, the hero in our Parsha, that happens to be the man from the water, Moshe, which is actually the root of his name is from the water, and the man in the water. They both really acted out of expediency, immediately, without questioning, with no reservations. Moshe with the difficulty of a people, the struggles, and having to deal with his consequences of his act, and this man in the water that also had the choice, the freedom of choice to choose, and dealt with his actions by losing his life.
Hello, my name is Harry Jelinek. I'm a member of the congregation. I was thinking something that seems to me that maybe is emotionally moving about the story is that this person probably committed the greatest act of his life. And I think myself, I don't know how I would react in a situation if I was ever called to act that way, but if I acted heroically, I think it would have somehow a tremendous effect on just my image of myself and the way I looked upon myself for the rest of my life. And here somebody did something like this and he maybe had 10 seconds to appreciate it. And I don't know, I think that's a part of the story that makes it, let's say, different from other stories that you read about where there's death.
I'm Barbara Davidson. I had a terrible moment that afternoon. My mother and father had left for Tampa in the middle of the storm from LaGuardia. And when I heard a plane from Tampa went down, I still can't even talk about it. It was a terrible moment. But I think what the story does bring to my mind is certainly it's got the quality of the Bridge of San Luis Rey, you know, and it certainly does point up to the randomness of the universe, and those people were very much in the same situation. I also wonder if the man who was so heroic, what was in his background? Where was he coming from? Was he Jewish? Was he Christian? Was he brought up in a military family? Was his background somehow that you take care of the women first before you go yourself? Did he, in fact, know that he was making a heroic act? Perhaps he really believed he'd be saved too. I mean, there were the rescue people right over his head. And these are all the questions that come to my mind. I don't know what the answers are. We never will.
I want to thank all of you who made contributions this morning. I think they were all beautiful and moving and relevant. I particularly thank the young lady who drew my attention to something that I had overlooked, although it would have fitted in even perfectly last week in terms of, except I didn't read the article until this week. How many of you did read the article, by the way? Only a few of you? This particular article. I'm talking about this particular article. I just want to know, I'm just interested. I'm making my own business survey. Hands up those who actually read this article. 1, 2, 3. I'm sorry? I'm asking who recognized the article that I commenced reading, that I read this morning. 3 people? 1, 2, 3. Yes, dear, the article that I read. No. I'm not asking whether it affected you. Of course it affected you. I simply want to know, factually, how many people in this room today read that article in the course of the last 2 weeks. So far I have 3 hands. Okay. It comes from last week's Time magazine. I just want to know how successful Time is. I imagine 90% of the people who read Time don't read it. And as a matter of fact, I almost didn't read it. I had read it, and I picked it up again after I'd read it because I didn't have anything to read at that particular moment of the day. And I accidentally, randomly opened it up, and I saw the phrase, "The Man in the Water," and the title appealed to me. And once I began to get into it, I realized that I was in the presence of a new perspective. And at that moment, immediately, like a flash, I knew I was going to talk about it this morning. The comparison with Moses was beautiful. I don't know which particular theme in Moses' life you were talking about, but the one that came to my mind was when last week in the Sedra of Shemot, when Moses went among his brethren and saw an Egyptian, and Vayifen kovacho vayar ki einish vayachet hamitzri. He killed the Egyptian almost without thinking about it. That kind of almost spontaneous act. Thank you very much indeed. As they say in Talmud, Habe lamadti merabotai, the yoter Umechavera yoter merabotai, umitamidai yoter mikolam. Much have I learned from my teachers, and more from my colleagues than from my teachers, but most of all from my pupils. I think the comments this morning were just superb and moving. I want to pick up Barbara's point. I also wanted to know where he was coming from, but on a much more cynical level than Barbara, because Barbara is a nicer person. I wanted to know whether his marriage was okay, what he had to go home to that night, whether his children were treating him nicely, whether he had a wife, whether there was a woman in his life, whether there was anybody in his life, whether he was suffering from some kind of terminal sickness, whether he just had x-rays, whether he'd been in Washington for some kind of whatever, something to do with his health. Did he have hope? Did he have faith? Was he on the verge of a new enterprise? Was he buying a new house? Was he getting married? Was he in love with somebody? Did he have a wife or a mistress or somebody who cared for him? In other words, what was he giving up? That is something that occurred to me. The reason I allowed the congregation to speak first was because it's not fair of me to pull rabbinical rank, but there were two areas which I was hoping somebody would raise. I'm not being judgmental. It's reflective on me as much as on you. This is a theological statement. This article is a profound theological statement written, of course, by a Jew, Roger Rosenblatt. It's a thoroughly Christian statement in many respects, and I want to speak about the theology because it's a central issue. And when I say it's a Christian as opposed to a Jewish issue, I don't mean that I take a Christian standpoint, because I think most of us would prefer to be able to do something like that, but not if it was a kind of suicide, a kind of a pleasant suicide that was wished on us, but that we were really giving something up. First, I want to make a reconstructionist point, and then I want to make a rabbinical point. And I don't know who Mr. Rosenblatt is, Mr. Roger Rosenblatt, but his theology fits my understanding of a 1982 Reconstructionist position perfectly. And that the theology of this article is not compatible with classical Reconstructionist theology. I have to make that point because attempts are made all over the place in Reconstructionist circles today to present Reconstructionism as something monolithic and classical, which it isn't. There are vast, radical disagreements within the Reconstructionist movement over ritual, over practice, over behavior, over liturgy, and crucially over theology. And it would be my effort in this pulpit to make sure that we all understand those differences, because the differences are crucial. Just let me read the crucial paragraph, and I'm sure, having read it, all of you will remember time and again the point that I have made on this issue. Yet there was something else about the man that kept our thoughts on him. He was there in the essential classic circumstance, man in nature, the man in the water. For its part, nature cared nothing about the 5 passengers. Our man, on the other hand, cared totally. The timeless battle commenced in the Potomac. As long as that man could last, they went at each other, nature and man. The one making no distinctions of good and evil, acting on no principles, offering no lifelines. The other acting wholly on distinctions, principles, and one supposes on faith. That statement is incompatible with Kaplan's Reconstructionism. However, I agree with it totally, and I disagree with Kaplan's position, and I have made that point over and over again. That is to say, the classical Reconstructionist position is that the universe is so constituted that we have a friend out there, that the universe is so constituted that it satisfies our needs and not our greeds, that somehow the cosmos on some level cares for us, that there is something in the cosmos which points in our direction, that the cosmos is not blind, implacable, lifeless, neutral, unconcerned. This is a theological point which has been presented in this synagogue for the last 15 years. I was hoping that at least one member here this morning, one congregant here, would pick up on it and say, but this is not Kaplan. The sources of this notion, of course, primarily would be Richard Rubinstein and Albert Camus. But note what it says. It doesn't say that there is no meaning. It doesn't say there is no spirituality. It does not even say there is no God. It simply says that if we look for spirituality, if we look for meaning, and if we look for God, there is only one place to find those qualities, and that is within human beings operating in society. And also I thought the point that was made, that it's marvelous, I thought Rosalind's point was beautiful, that it's easy to make the grand gesture. But what about those? I did a funny thing. I was on the subway when I read the news, shortly after I read this article, and I was, rushing in as usual to try to get a seat, and at the point of getting in, somebody else was trying to get in who was older and fatter than me, and with a prodigious effort, I drew backwards, and in an act of grace, totally unlike me, allowed the other people to get into the subway car first and take the remaining seats. A far reach from giving one's life in an icy river, but on such little things, the whole quality of life in this city is made or broken. And I thought Rosalind really made a marvelous point there. Do you want...
What about the man who gave his life?
I'm sorry?
What about the man who gave up his life?
Yes.
Isn't he also a product of nature?
Yes, of course he's a product of nature. But to say that he's a product of nature means that he is a product of nature the way the coelacanth is a product of nature, the way the dinosaur is a product of nature, the way the pterodactyl is a product of nature, the way the DNA molecule is a product of nature. And what Kaplan is saying is something that ultimately, Arthur, we're going to have to acknowledge to be the last vestiges of 19th century liberal optimism. It's a form of teleological vitalism. It is riddled through Kaplan's theology at this point in connection with good and evil and over this issue, which is such a central issue for all of us. Kaplan will not accept the fact that life is random. Kaplan will not accept the fact that man evolved randomly via natural selection and random mutation. Kaplan insists that the cosmos has a divine nisus which ends or culminates in man as we are, and that the universe, as we have heard him say time and again, is constituted to satisfy our needs and not our greeds. I, on the other hand, with Camus and Rubinstein, see man emerging the way everything else emerged, without precedent. It does not make it less meaningful. This act is no less meaningful because it occurs within a context of a random neutral universe. In fact, I think it is the more beautiful. There's a program on television right now which, because of being in bed for so long, I've been having an orgy of, Life on Earth. I wonder whether any of you watched that and felt as overwhelmed as I did with the challenge to Reconstructionism in that program also, with its talk of millions and billions of years, with its talk of a universe whose time clock reduced to 1 year puts man emerging 1 minute before midnight on December the 31st. That perspective is incompatible with Mordecai Kaplan's viewpoint. Arthur, it has to be said loudly, because the Reconstructionist movement will not survive to the 21st century unless we disencumber ourselves from 19th century modes of thinking and begin to reach out to the same challenges of the latter quarter of the 20th century, which Kaplan tried to measure up to in the first quarter of the 20th century.
Are you insisting that this man's action is an example of a random operation of nature?
No, I am insisting that this man's action, of course, bearing in mind the qualifications that Barbara and I raise. I'm very interested, for example, if a man is chaste, I want to know how many women are around. If a man is chaste in a Boy Scout camp, I'm not terribly impressed. If a man is chaste in a Playboy mansion, I'm terribly impressed. In other words, morality and availability are two sides of the same coin. We are speaking of an ideal act of charity. I am assuming that this man did have something to come home to. If this man was getting a divorce, all of his children were on the streets prostitutes, and he just had a bankruptcy, and his house had just burned down, and he just learned that morning that he had terminal cancer, then I have to discount the quality of what he did, because the value of a moral act is not absolute, it is relative. It is related to other things that are going on. I don't want to break off at this point. Out of respect to Arthur, I wanted to deal with his point, but I want to make it quite clear. I respect Mordecai Kaplan. That's why I disagree with him. I respect this essay, The Man in the Water. I regard this as a sacred text. I would attach it to the Bible, but to the New Testament, not the Old Testament. And I treat it with a sacredness, with all the respect that a sacred text deserves, by disagreeing with it. I don't agree with the article on some profound level, and that's what I want to share with you. No, when I watched The Origins of Life on Channel 13 and saw the man informing me that there were 250,000 different kinds of beetles in the world, I had to measure up that efflorescence of life against the notion that the cosmos is so made as to satisfy human needs and not human greeds, and the statement became totally meaningless. We are in the presence of life which is here, and that is real. The quality of life is real. The quality of this man's sacrifice is real. But unfortunately, we cannot extrapolate that reality into the cosmos. The cosmos works, as far as we know, implacably and without distinction. As a matter of fact, long before Kaplan and before Roger Rosenblatt, the author of this article, Pascal said it all in a beautiful and memorable quotation, which I could give you in French, but I'll give it to you in English instead. Paraphrased. Man is but a reed, but he is a thinking reed. It is not necessary for the entire universe to arm itself against man in order to destroy man. One single drop of water, one rock, can destroy all man's hopes. But at the very moment man is being destroyed by the universe, man is superior to the universe, because the universe is totally oblivious to the fact that it is destroying man. But man is absolutely conscious that he is being destroyed by the universe. Therefore, Pascal says, our entire hope rests in thought, reflection. I might say even reconstructionism, but a reconstructionism that will not saddle itself to the past, but is determined to move forward to the future with as much honesty and integrity as it can summon up. We have to say goodbye to this teleological vitalism with which our prayer book is riddled, with which our English prayers written by Kaplan and Steinberg and Eugene Cohn are riddled, and which the entire corpus of Kaplan's literature is riddled. Why don't you read it yourselves? Don't take it from me. Go home and take a book of Kaplan out and read what he has to say about nature and man. Read the meaning of God in modern Jewish religion. Read the relevant sections in the third part of Judaism and civilization. Don't take it from me, God forbid. Go and read yourselves, Zil Gomor, and you will see that there is no compatibility at all between Kaplan's major statements about the relation of man and the universe and this position, which I take to be a highly relevant current position of man in the age of the death of God, as Rubinstein has reminded us so convincingly, where we must take revelation from where we get it, even from the back page of Time magazine and from life. And by the way, I include under that rubric of divinity the beautiful quality and the emotions of those members of the congregation who came forward and spoke today, as well as the action of the people who volunteered their very lives at the Potomac, contingent upon where they were at. That is to say, an action cannot be seen to me moral purely objectively. I want to know what's going on inside of the mind of the person. A man may be virtuous because he has no desire not to be virtuous. Therefore, in my book, he is not virtuous. A man may be immoral, but if we knew the drive to immorality within him, we would say, how marvelous! He was so little immoral. The two images of the last 10 days are Jack Abbott stabbing a man in ferocious, barbaric anger because the man wouldn't let him pee, killing a man because he wouldn't let him use the lavatory in the restaurant, which again the jury rightly had to look at in spite of all the anger and the anguish. What kind of a person was that? What had happened to him up to that point? In the same way as the man in the water, what kind of a childhood had Jack Abbott? You can't ignore these questions. You don't have to let the man out on the street. And one feels very sorry for Norman Mailer at this point in time, and how all of us should recognize that literary ability has nothing whatsoever to do with morality. I'm sorry, I'm afterwards. I want to get to my points, otherwise I'll never get there. So that's the first point, Jack Abbott and the man in the water. But I wanted to stress particularly how important it is for our reconstructionists to be able to read a page from Time magazine with some kind of understanding. I mean, all this talk about reconstructionism and the movement and fundraising, we're all a bunch of sophisticated people. We probably have more bachelors and masters and PhDs than the rank and file Jewish denominations all over the world. But are we aware of where thoughtful people are in the world today? This is a magazine that is read by how many millions of people? And our own traditions. We have to evaluate anew where we stand in this regard. Otherwise, our children and grandchildren will have nothing to learn from what we transmit to them. We must be able to grapple with this issue theologically. We must have the honesty to say, does it measure up to us? Now, curiously enough, although I don't find much in Reconstructionism which helps me in this issue, there are classical rabbinic statements, and it was my regret this week that I don't have in my library the complete essays of Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am devoted an entire famous seminal essay, which perhaps at one of the retreats we really ought to discuss line by line. While I'm talking, it suddenly occurs to me, we've done everything at retreats except have seminar studies on actual texts. An essay by Achad Ha'am, a couple of essays by Achad Ha'am, for example, his essay on Moses, and his essay on the difference between Christian and Jewish ethics. But let me go to the Talmud. Let me go back as far as I can to begin with. And then to give you another example. This is from Bava Metzia Samach Bet Amud Aleph. Shnayim shehayu mahalchin baderech. Two men are going on a journey in a desert. Uviyad echad mehen kiton shomayim, and one of them has a bottle of water. Im shotim shneihem meitim. If they both drink the bottle of water, they will both die, because they are in a desert and they are so far removed from and don't come up with answers as to how if they have a drop and then they run and they walk backwards, because it's meant to be a Weberian ideal case. So don't start. There used to be a program on BBC television, and when they presented this kind of a theme, people would write in letters to say that if they got up early in the morning and did somersaults and let the water dribble down their necks, they'd survive. No, we're not interested in that. We're talking about an ideal case. There's only enough water for one man to get back to civilization. There are two people, and somebody has to die. Im shotin shneihem meitim, v'im shoteh echad mehen magia liyishuv. If they both drink, they'll both die. But if one drinks and one has the bottle in his pouch, Darash ben Petora. Ben Petora expounded, Mutav sheyishu shnehem. It is better that they both die. V'al yireh echad mehem b'mitato shel chaviro, rather than that one should look upon the death of the other. The most cruel thing about the Abbott story was the witness who observed him stab the man and then stand over him, ridiculing him as he died. You have to be very sick, not only to kill, but to enjoy the killing. Ben Petura, we don't know about Ben Petura. We don't know who he is. It's the only time in the entire rabbinic literature, Ben Petura, imagine, a funny name, the only one time in the entire corpus of rabbinic literature he's mentioned. Better that they both drink. Let not one look at his neighbor dying. Ad sheba Rabbi Akiva. Until Rabbi Akiva came along, the limaid and taught. V'chei achicha imach. Scripture says, thy brother shall live with thee. Chayecha kodmin lechayei chavercha. Your life takes priority to the life of your brother. Now let us apply the story of the bottle to the story of the man in the water. But before doing so, I would like to give you one more rabbinic example. You know, in Reconstructionist circles these days, I hear a great deal of talk about the past having a vote, but not a veto. But I tend to hear a lot more vetoing than voting. What I mean to say is that one hears very little which gives evidence that the spokesmen know anything about Jewish tradition, but are very much aware of what people do in the 20th century. The meaning of the proposition, the past has a vote but not a veto, has only meaning if the knowledge of the vote has any significance. A bunch of illiterate Jews devoting to have Shabbos on Wednesday because they work on Saturday is not Reconstructionism, although I have recently read Reconstructionist literature which points in that direction. That is to say, all that you have to do is a group of Jews together who decide what they should do as Jews. There's just one qualification, as my grandmother would say, nur fehltes ein Zach. You have to know a little bit about what you're changing. Otherwise, changing is not only immoral, it's obscene. And we make laughing stocks of ourselves in the presence of the knowledgeable Jewish world when we put forward the viewpoint that illiterate Jews, whether they're called Reconstructionists or anybody else, can decide what to do when they don't know. Regretfully, we still need experts. Here is the second example from Jewish tradition. Ha'isha, it's also from the Talmud. Ha'isha shehi makasha le'leid. When a woman is on the point of giving birth to a child, and there is trouble with the childbirth, and there is no way of saving the mother and the child. Mechatchin et havlad b'me'eha. The 9-month child is chopped to pieces in her womb, umotziin oto evarim evarim, and is brought out of the mother's womb bloody bit by bloody bit. Mipnei shechayeha, the life of the mother, kodmim l'chayav, takes priority over the life of the child. Again, don't give me any klotz kashas. We're dealing with a situation where we're not in Mount Sinai Hospital and we can't do a cesarean, and it's either the mother or the child. Here is another area where Jewish religion differs radically from Christianity, whether we like it or not. And as my friend Ignaz Meibam used to say, my dear friends, are we still Jews or are we Christians? And I ask that question of all of us today, because when I read this article, I was a Christian. And I had this Danny Kaye fantasy, Walter Mitty, oh, it's okay, I'm from the SAJ, off you go, that's all right, I don't mind, I like cold water. Didn't all of us, on some level, have this Walter Mitty notion that we too could do this? And of course the fact is, as Scott of the Antarctic found out to his peril, if you're really in cold water, you don't know how long you've got, because coldness is one of the most deadly things. Before you can make your mind up, it sweeps you away. And somebody made that point, that maybe he had thought that we are imputing our kind of value in a situation which doesn't really apply, because he was overwhelmed by fatigue and didn't know that he had every intention of being a hero. But in fact, he was sucked under without knowing it. Now, everybody knows that in Roman Catholic Christianity, at least, it's a vast subject. It is not the case that the mother's life is saved over the child's. On the contrary, the mother has to be killed because the child has to be baptized. And it's not just the issue of the baptism. A whole way of life is expressed in the different way we approach this moral issue. Im eina nili nili. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? This article by Roger Rosenblatt, who has to be Jewish, doesn't sound like an Armenian, is a Christian article. Greater love hath no man than he give up his life for his fellow man. That is a Christian doctrine. The unknown soldier. This is mythological. It is a paradigm. The unknown soldier is a Christian idea. The notion that one man in one massive, glorious, heroic act can save the entire world. It's not a Jewish idea. Rosalind reminded me that at the end of Yom Kippur, we do not end Yom Kippur with the blowing of the shofar, although 20 years ago at the SAJ we did. There was a mass stampede. It was like rawhide. As soon as the shofar blew, everybody had to get back to that cup of coffee. But we reintroduced the traditional practice of cooling off. In Orthodox synagogues, you daven Mariv after the shofar is blown. Why? And in my father's house, as soon as you went home and had a mouthful of food, my father went into the backyard and began to put the sukkah up. Why? Because Judaism does not believe that life is lived on the top of the mountain with these glorious, heroic acts of self-sacrifice. It's the day in, day out, long haul, the little nameless, unremembered acts of charity which don't get into the newspaper, which are not the subject of a Time editorial essay. And that's why Yom Kippur symbolically does not end with the blowing of the shofar, or with the words recited at the experience on Mount Carmel, Adonai Hu Elohim, this massive demonstration that Elijah and his God, Adonai Hu Elohim, Yahweh is God, not Baal. Judaism stresses the non-spectacular. Now, I'm not saying here that Judaism is better or worse, although Ahad Ha'am comes out with the suggestion that Jewish ethics are superior. And he has a point. If I remember the point correctly, it's this: if you live your entire life indoctrinated in the belief that the goal is to not try to be heroic every single day, But to find some occasion when you can be crucified, when you can stand up in front of lots of people and give your life for others, that will affect the quality of what you do the other 364 days of the year. That if you live in terms of Olam Haba, if you live in terms of the next world, you'll be in a little bit too much of a hurry to get there. And so death will govern life instead of living in terms of this world. No one wishes to reduce the quality of the heroism of this man one bit. But there were 5 women there. Suppose after 3, he had said, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to be selfish. My ass is freezing, and I'm going. Would anybody point a finger at him and say, you despicable creature? You mean you didn't let those 2 women go forward? What is this business of women first? Aren't we living in an era of feminism? What kind of false doctrine is this? Why didn't some woman say, you go first? Women have more subcutaneous fat than men. I reckon from a biological point of view, a woman could have survived in that water much longer than a skinny man. I'm raising these questions because you don't have to go to the Bible or the Talmud or the Midrash to be challenged and shocked into a question, am I really a Reconstructionist? Am I really a Jew? Am I really a Christian? Here is an ordinary Time magazine essay. How many copies of Time magazine go out each week? It's not a question of how many are read. How many? Millions of people all over the world read this. This is a theological statement, all the more dangerous in a sense, because it's so convincing and so gripping. And if nobody drew your attention to it, you might never think that there were other alternatives there. Jewish tradition disagrees radically with this, no matter where we stand, no matter what we would do personally. And of course this raises another interesting question. When we say, are we Jewish today? Sometimes it's impossible to say that. That is to say, one can study the tradition. The past does have a vote. The first thing one has to know at least is what the tradition says. Can you see now how ludicrous it would be to have a discussion on this essay without knowing that Judaism has some striking, basic information on this moral issue? It's an issue which has cropped up before. If somebody comes up to you, the Talmud says, and puts a rifle or pistol to your head and says, I'm going to blow your brains out if you don't kill this man. The Talmud again says, your life comes first. These are issues which were real issues in the Holocaust. Habor lahorgecho hashkem lahorgo. Just a moment. No, hold it, just a moment. Hold it, I'm sorry, hold it. I may have made a mistake. I want to be corrected. Let's not go on to the concentration camps. Just to, please. Do you have... Yeah. No, I'm talking about something else. And I don't have the actual quotation here, so I'm going to withdraw it. But the quotation that I remember is, if somebody comes to you, of course it doesn't say a pistol, and says, if you don't kill that man, I'm going to kill you. I think actually it's in Bavmat, and the answer is, you can't do anything because you don't know whether you're better than the other guy. Is that what you're saying? Mordecai? I apologize. Right, okay. The other... You're right. Right. My damach didach sumak michavrach. There's another quotation actually. Haba lahorgecha hashkem lahorgo. If somebody is going for you, you have a right to kill him. It's another one. By the way, I'm sorry, just... Okay, go ahead. But by the way, the lady over there... You were first. All right, go ahead. That's another one. I know that one too. Give us one of your women or we'll kill the lot of you. Yeah. Do you know what the answer to that one is, by the way? If there are a group, this has actually happened both in Germany but also in ancient Jewish tradition. If there are a group of women in a room and the oppressors come and they say, we want one of those women to rape. Give us one of them. You have to refuse, unless they point out a specific person. They all have to give it their lives rather than one person be given up. But if they name a specific person... That's another case. That's another thing altogether. That's the only three things for which a Jew must not give his life, must give his life. In other words, Kiddush Hashem is Avodah Zarah, Gilui Arayot, and Shifichut Damim. Idolatry, immorality, and murder. But those are exceptional cases. The lady in the back had a hand up, yes. Yeah.
And I was wondering about the idea of the Messiah, somebody supposedly dying for, mankind. Where is this idea about the Messiah?
Well, my idea, that's a whole different subject, and I really don't want to talk about Messiah. I'll be very happy to deal with it on some future occasion. But right now, but right now I really want to stress the point that I see here. The issue that, if I remember correctly, Achad Ha'am mentions is that the Talmud is incorrect. The issue is not they should both drink and both die. The issue is the Christian belief that the man who has the bottle should give it to the other man. That's the issue, that's the issue that Achad Ha'am raises. And that is what this man was doing. This man had the bottle. He could have saved himself, if not after the first or the second, certainly after the third. He gave the bottle of water to the other person. And Jewish tradition says he didn't have to. It would have been perfectly okay. For appearance's sake, he should let 2 or 3 go first. The issue of whether women expect to be given first priority these days is a whole other issue I wouldn't even want to touch on. That's a dangerous topic. It's a dangerous topic altogether, but that also has to be raised. Somebody raised the question of whether this man had been brought up in a home where women always had to be first, and whether he was brainwashed. Maybe in 50 years' time, when a different ethic has been taught in human relationships, maybe something else would have happened. The issue is whether the quality that you will place on this world will be that much diminished if you value too highly the next world. It's a classical heresy. It's a Manichaean heresy. It's the issue of body and soul, flesh and the spirit. That is a central issue that is being raised in this particular connection. We don't quite know how to resolve that one, yes.
My one reaction to this is wondering when, in a moment of crisis, a person really makes decisions, or whether the act is based purely on instinct. In my experience of truly critical situations that I've been through, it seems to me that the mental process stops and the gut process takes over. And what that gut process is based on is the question. How much of that is purely an emotional, completely personal, subjective reaction, and how much of it is based on one's own life experiences and morality, which is able to come into effect at such a
We touched on that point earlier, and I think what you're saying is true. On the other hand, in the same way that one begins life struggling to get certain things together physiologically and finally they take over and become autonomous, I think that there are certain actions that can be ingrained in one by one's environment, by one's education, that ultimately lead to one behaving automatically, almost instinctively, in a certain way, on a certain occasion. I would like to conclude my remarks by getting back to this television program again. When I finished reading this article, I thought of the Attenborough program and all the 250,000 beetles and those horrible slug things floating around in the bottom of the water, and all that teeming profusion of life from which we came, those weird creatures that know exactly what point in the sand to lay their eggs, where the sand will be dry for a whole month, but at the new moon the tide will come in and sweep the eggs down into the water again just at the right time. And it seems to me that somewhere along the line at the end of this program, and indeed those of you who saw the Bronowski series will remember that the very last image of that series of programs was Bronowski at Auschwitz, picking up a handful of dirt in which he said, "The bones of my own family may be found." In other words, at the end of all these beetles and all these creepy crawly things, these ghastly looking reptiles, etc., and the whole story and saga of evolution, with all its possible interpretations, whether or not this man was a hero, the author of this article had the need to make him into one. That is the mythological urge. And that also, Arthur, is part of what evolution has produced. And I always say this when families produce a child because of an accident. It happens. You'd be surprised how many accidents there are around. and they decide to have the baby. Incidentally, I must tell you this experience, and also this experience, reading this article, made me think again about the whole question of abortion. Much as I dislike much that is being said on the opposition side, but there are certain things that I don't like on the pro-abortion side either. It's somewhere in between. There's too much stridency. Life is so precious. Every ember has to be protected. We have to think very hard before we wipe out any life. That life might be the Messiah. We don't really know. And so at the end of this program, surely we have to flash this on the scene also. If you have an accident, the baby is an accident, all right, you didn't intend to have the baby. You may be upset, you can't afford it, and then the baby finally arrives. Anybody who's had this experience knows that the fact that the baby wasn't planned, the fact that the baby was as random as they come, there was a blackout that night, or somebody forgot something, does that mean that the baby is loved less? Should the heroism of man and man's drive to create heroes, even where perhaps heroism isn't warranted, is that less beautiful and less meaningful because the cosmos is not so constituted as to satisfy human needs and not human greeds? I think we've got things in wrong perspective. What is revelatory, what is godlike, what is the essence of what life is about, is the reality of the spirituality that we can experience right here and now. And insofar as we can find these thoughts and these ideas adumbrated, reflected in our sacred texts, so much the better for our sacred texts. And if we can't, so much the worse for our sacred texts. None of our sacred texts are above criticism, including the ones, the beautiful ones, that Kaplan added to enrich our own Jewish tradition. We are Jews first. We should say perhaps we are human beings first, then Jews, then Reconstructionists. And let's not get our priorities out of kilter. And one really final point. I thought of the state of Israel. You know, people say to the state of Israel, why are you so difficult? Why don't you roll over? After all said and done, you know, you've got to give something in order to have peace. At the end of a week where the United Nations excelled itself even in its own brand of hypocrisy, at the end of a week where we can see that clearly the world applies two different standards of morality to the Jewish people and to the rest of the world. It's kind of a compliment in a sense, you see. They don't expect the other mamzerim to behave in any kind of way, so they expect something but from us, you see, it's like having the favorite pupil. It's like the prophets with the Jewish people, Rak etchem yadati. At the end of such a week, one has to also say to our brethren in the state of Israel, we criticize you. We regard your morality at fault from time to time. But ultimately, when the chips are down, we also know that the paradigm which we expect you to apply to yourselves is not the paradigm of Time magazine. We do not expect the Jewish people to pass out this rope backwards and forwards so every little Arab state and every little African state in the world can survive, and then the Jews should get their tuchus frozen. That's not the image. Let us not become the ones who grab the rope first and say to hell with the rest of the world. Let's not be chazerim. That was the issue that I was raising when I raised the issue of Israelis doing business with South African fascists and Nazis. But there is another point of view. Emein anili mili. The Jewish people is expected by the world and also by Jews to have a higher standard of morality than the Saudis and the Libyans. But when the chips are down, we don't expect them to wait for the fifth lady to get picked up and then go down in glory and be immortally memorialized on the back pages of Time magazine. One woman, two women, but not more than three. At which point the Jew says, look here, my dear friends, we also want to live. We also have our rights. You don't like it? It's tough. Somebody else will be hurt? It's tough. The issue we must agonize over is how many women go before we make that decision. 1, 2, 3. These are issues we have to decide in our lives every single day. There are no easy solutions. There are no easy answers. But I had to raise the question. And I hope I have pleased some of you all of the time, and all of you some of the time. I never hope ever, before the Messiah comes, to please all of you all the time. We rise for Aleinu on page 194.